to talk a little bit more about Jacob. We're reaching the end of this 20-year saga with him and Laban, which is a very long time just to get a wife, but then he gets like 4 wives, kind of. Well, 2 plus 2 extras, kind of. So we're going to unpack just a little bit of his interesting, 17th century animal husbandry practices, and then his wrestling match with some mysterious masked man. Sound good? So, first, just as we're unpacking, start of chapter, or the end of chapter 30, beginning of chapter 31, this is Jacob's departure, that he's ready to hit the road. Joseph is born to Rachel, his beloved Rachel, and he's like, all right, now I really got to go home. I want to get a move on. And you read in the text a couple places of, and this isn't the only time, but we get an interesting picture of Jacob's own sort of like concerns and worries and like kind of nervousness about either confronting Laban or confronting his brother Esau as well. And this is an interesting theme just to have in the back of our mind. So he kind of sneaks away after having this interesting arrangement about the sheep and the goats and the livestock. Jacob's made Laban a very, very wealthy man over the last 20 years. I mean, he's kind of working for free, but apparently Jacob has some skill with raising up some livestock. So the one ironic thing I wanted to call out, whenever Jacob leaves and then Laban's sons are kind of gifted some of the sheep and they're kind of complaining that Jacob has taken all of their birthright, it kind of echoes what Esau says to Isaac back in Genesis chapter 27, which is just an interesting thing to see how this sort of the cycle continues, even with an uncle, not just his brother. So, Jacob encountered with God, but first we got to talk about, wait a second, I skipped one. Oh, dang it, I gave it away. So, I was really, really proud of that one. So,
stand-up comedy is not a news.
Oh, that's a missed opportunity. Recorded for all eternity. So, there's this interesting arrangement that Jacob makes with Laban about, Laban can have all the really nice, unblemished goats and sheep and all the rest, but he wants, or he can have the speckled or the spotted ones too. And there's this interesting description of Jacob apparently setting up some weird arrangement with like little poplar reeds and green and white stripes, and somehow that the animals are going to see that and be inspired, perhaps, which is really odd. So there's some couple allusions in some ancient texts sort of mentioning that this is some ancient like folklore, perhaps. I can't say much more than that, then there's not much else to substantiate that. All science we know now is that, whatever the animal might be looking at has no bearing on what comes later. But what we do see very clearly is that Jacob is in control of the breeding, and he separates the stronger ones from the weaker ones, so he is like very intentional and has sort of a good handle on how to like actually grow the herd well. But the most important thing to note is how he gives thanks to God, and he recognizes that all this happened just because of God. So I wish I had more elaborate insight on 17th century BC animal husbandry, but I don't. The key takeaway from this whole section is Jacob continually and very honestly attributes it back to God as he should, which is what we see again and again. So I wish I had more. I try to find a cool little cartoon depiction of his little attic setup with, I don't even know how to describe it. The text is very odd in how it phrases little wreaths with specks of white and green. I don't know, but I couldn't find anything, so I don't think anyone else is that keen on it either. So then we're going to come out his departure. We already did. So Jacob has this encounter with God, but first we have to ask this question. Act like you didn't see before. Who is this person? Who could it be? Oh my goodness. So, thank you for laughing. So in the text it describes that this mysterious man kind of grabs him all of a sudden, and in the text just mentions a man. The Hebrew is mentioning just some man, some person. Hosea chapter 12 very clearly describes exactly who this is and names this man as an angel. This is verses 3 through 5, which recounts, obviously, this is a man who grasped at his brother's heel. That's Jacob in the womb, reaching for his brother. And a man he struggled with God, which is a really helpful depiction or characterization of this whole encounter with this masked man. He wasn't really masked, it's just in the night. And he struggles, and in Hosea's words, he says he overcame him. And then he begged for favor, and then he mentions the two places that Jacob sort of encounters God, which we first read on his journey towards going to old Uncle Laban at Bethel, and then here where he mentions the Lord being his name, and then he names the place Peniel, depending on what you want to call it. So that's why in all the depictions, when you look at Jacob wrestling with God, or wrestling an angel, all of them are described or depicted as some angel. And I have lots of fun artwork for us to examine. All of them mention or show it as an angel. This is from some Russian painter around 1000 AD, which is quite interesting. There's a lovely little icon, and I want to call out that it has God sort of overlooking them to kind of, it really just looks like they're hugging and embracing, not so much a wrestling match. But, which is another point to have in mind as we're sort of conceptualizing what this encounter is. The text describes it as a struggle or a wrestle, but in the pictures, I'll let you make your own conclusion for how it's depicted, what Jacob is doing, and what the angel is doing to him. A brief note on some other translations or translations of this name Israel, and reading this chapter. Ancient church historian by the name of Josephus, who writes in the 1st century, described it like this: one that struggled with the divine angel, and a bunch of other famous writers that the names don't mean anything, but these are some other descriptions of who Jacob is with this new name Israel. A prince of God, he will rule as God, a man seeing God, or one who has prevailed with God, which are all slightly different facets of what happens with Jacob. My favorite title of this, that I find really humorous, is to call it the World Heavyweight Title Match. And I had another name, but it wasn't as funny, so that's going to be up there. This is a German depiction from the 14th century, which is really interesting, too. It looks more like, it really just looks like they're hugging, more than anything else. As we think back and understand what this whole scene is, just before this, the text describes Jacob sort of like he's sent on his family and all the livestock on ahead, and he's all alone and kind of wondering what's going to happen in the next day. Now, in the text, it's very odd because it's really hard to sort of grasp who is sort of winning from moment to moment. It's kind of odd, and the subjects get a little blurred on who sort of has the upper hand. And I don't think that is an issue, because the end result is what matters most. The thing to recognize here that this encounter is completely different than every other situation. Well, not completely different, but it's distinct from the rest of Jacob's life, where from very early on, he was able to sort of maneuver and kind of scheme his way into getting what he wanted, whether it be the birthright or kind of navigating. He worked on his negotiation skills with Laban, and it took a couple of decades, but in the end, he kind of came out ahead. But in here, it's just described that all he can do is hold on, and he can't do much else. All the scheming and strategy is not possible here. Here's two more depictions of the struggle, and it's kind of hard to see, sorry, but I want to call it this really lovely depiction of sort of a more fearsome, kind of ethereal angel that has really dramatic and cool, I don't know, costuming or description. I don't know. It's just fun. It's just fun. again, it's a little unclear about what's really happening. The word for wrestle in this text is only used here. It's not used anywhere else in the Old Testament. And some of the takeaways after sort of Jacob gets his new name and he does receive God's blessing right there, which is also distinct, that it says he blesses him there, right at that time, not just, I'm going to bless you in the future. There's some specificity to it too. But the limp is sort of like a lasting impression, which we'll unpack here in just a minute. And the last thing to note again about what it says, that he names this place Peniel, meaning the face of God. And this is also significant because in all of the Old Testament, there are a quite shocking few number of people that have such a close encounter with God and live to, tell the tale, right? We have this very common theme that no one can see the face of God and live, and then he has some encounter. Moses has an encounter with God in the burning bush. This is similar. Abraham has a similar encounter too with God, who also changes his name as well. Here's two more interesting depictions. This is probably the most interesting wrestling one, and I like this because the angel looks to be in complete control and kind of withholding himself a little bit, like he could take over and win at any moment, just think an arm wrestling, and the guy's like, okay, I'll kind of let you take it easy, and then he destroys him. But one great interpretation about this that is more applicable to us is that this is Jacob and our own struggle to actually see and encounter God. And that's all I'll say, because we need to keep going. But the really important takeaway as we're reading and tracing this larger narrative in Genesis and how God reveals and his plan for this new creation that starts with Israel and then is renewed and fulfilled and carried on with us is that Jacob getting this name Israel is a really big deal because it signifies the dawn of the birth of this new nation. It starts with him having a whole bunch of kids, which become the different tribes of Israel, of course. And previously, every time they talked about God, they mentioned that God gets attached to one of the patriarchs. So it was God of Abraham for a while, and then God of Abraham and Isaac for a little bit, and now he gets thrown in there too. But then if you also think about other parts of the Old Testament and the New, when we talk about the God of Israel is a very common short phrase term too, that Abraham and Moses and the rest are still considered, but it gets lumped up in Israel, which is also Jacob, which is also one that struggles with God. And that becomes a characterization for the people of Israel throughout their whole history, and in some ways even to this day. If you think about what the Jews have continued to struggle with even just last century as well. Or the rest of the matches that struggle with us. And you think about this too. There's another image that I stumbled upon today to understand this. If you've ever had a golf lesson, or think of any other physical activity, and you have someone who is actually trying to maneuver your hands or your arms or your body in a way to actually show you what is the correct thing to do, it feels very clunky and odd and awkward, and it's a struggle to actually understand, and there's no way around it, but it is awkward and you feel kind of clumsy. Or just like if you're trying to do something with your left hand, if you're right-handed, it's clumsy to do. But it takes time to work at it too. And you still remember sort of what it was like to do how you struggled before. And there's more to it, but I'm sorry, there was fast enough to you. When you have someone who actually knows what they're doing, like a golf instructor, the first time I got a lesson with Bill Bartholomew, he was calling me a fool and all the rest because I didn't know what I was doing, which is accurate. But part of it, when you go to someone who actually knows what they're doing, you don't realize all the ways that you're messing up too. And you need some help to actually have your eyes open and your whole self open to how you're actually supposed to accomplish whatever task it is too. And that, I think, can be applicable in a lot of ways. There's a great question of what's the deal with the limp? Like, he kind of comes away, he gets blessed, a new name, he's all feeling good, but then he gets somehow sort of like hip checked in his sciatic nerve maybe. And there's a question like, why is that? There's some old dietary restriction mentions in some texts that the Jews like to, at one point they didn't eat food from the animal from that particular part of the body for some reason. I don't know, there's not much basis for that. But that's, if you hear that, that's kind of been mentioned. The whole encounter for us is an analogy for our prayer life and for our faith too. And one of the components of the Christian life is to persevere in faith continually, to really work at that, and that takes time. But also, his physical nature, just like his name is changed, his physical nature is changed too. And the limp sort of becomes a reminder. And there's some old sermons that mention describing how Jacob is going to limp away and walk away, changed forever, that he won't walk straight the way that he used to because he is physically changed from this encounter with God. So it could be kind of an analogy. Some people see it as a foreshadowing of the wounds of Christ too. St. Ambrose mentions this rather morbid depiction of this. The cross of Christ who would bring salvation to all people by spreading the forgiveness of sins throughout the whole world. He does this through the numbness and torpidity of his own body. That just like his hip is supposedly sort of numbed or made lame in some way, that Christ's own lifeless, limp body does bring about some new life too. If you want to read Jesus into it, that's kind of nice to do too. Maybe it's a stretch, but this is what some people read. It is what it is. So this is from a beautiful church in Paris called the Church of St. Sulpice, and this is a close-up of them wrestling there too. And in all of those, we see a great deal, most consistently Jacob is depicted with, he's kind of shredded and yoked and really, really struggling. But so often, I can't help but see that it kind of looks like they're kind of holding hands and embracing in some way, too. And it begs the question of, who is really fighting who, and how much of it is actually a fight or just an encounter? And how much of this is Jacob just trying to unload part of himself and sort of ask for forgiveness in some way and seek some help and sort of consolation or encouragement too. And so that brings us back to us reading this as a depiction of our prayer life. And just in the same way that Jacob has to sort of own up to who he is, and he gives away his name, which is a kind of a significant deal. That's sort of like the turning point in the fight, if you will. For us, prayer requires trust and a certain nearness and like a close contact with God, and that's kind of the goal in some way too. And how this is, if we think of the encounter as like this wrestling match where they're like fighting or at odds with each other in some way, that's not really as helpful. It may feel like that, and just like it may feel like that in our own lives when we're praying or struggling with something, that it feels like we're at odds and clashing. But perhaps we can see it as we're clashing with our own selves. Because the angel there is sort of just accepting, in most of those depictions you see him, he's just sort of accepting Jacob and wanting to sort of help him work through his issues and then give him a hug at the end. Which ultimately is more likely what God is trying to do in your own lives too. And it begs the question, as we're all sort of struggling with whatever we have on our minds and our hearts, that we should always ask the question, do I really feel like God is the issue here, or is it perhaps there's some stumbling blocks that I've put up for myself that is limiting the relationship? And I'm seeing some nods, and perhaps maybe there's some truth. Jacob's struggle in this, we should call out the good components of what Jacob is doing. We see through his whole life, he's been quite determined and persistent, and he doesn't really get deterred. 7 years before he gets to marry the next girl apparently is just okay, so he's clearly got some significant level of patience. It is true, thank you, it is true. And for us, union with God requires the same earnestness too, and that's one of the goals of the Christian life. And the most powerful way that this happens is when we sort of fully give up all of ourselves over to God. We see this kind of mentioned here in the text when they have this exchange where they're both asking each other, like, who are you? And the other one says, who are you? And, obviously the angel doesn't say, I'm an angel, but Jacob says his name is Jacob. And that's the turning point. And some people see that as sort of Jacob fully giving up of himself. So finally, to bring it full circle, I want to jump briefly to Jacob and Esau's reconciliation. Just like with Jacob and Laban's last sort of like encounter where they had a nice little covenant and they said, hey, I won't kill you, you don't kill me, and then they kind of part ways. It's kind of amusing to see how quickly it all kind of comes together and everything turns out to be okay. Jacob's like really nervous about the whole thing, and he sent whole truckloads of sheep on ahead to try to win his brother over, and he's very honest about it, right? And what's really fun to see is it mentions, he's bowing down 7 times or something like that, which is, an ancient, practice that has other reference. Like that's a supreme level of reverence and deference to the other person. But it's funny, it says that Esau falls on his neck, which seems kind of odd, like, is he just clumsy or what? But I want to call out one more little illustration for us before we finish, that just like way back in the womb when they were struggling in sort of chasing after each other, and Jacob is like grabbing onto his heel, and like there's the struggle from the very beginning of their life, that in the end they come back together, and Esau falls on his neck, but now they come and are made whole together, and they both call out that God is like fully in their presence. Jacob's just had this remarkable experience with God, but both of them talk about how, like, I see the face of God in you, which is really nice and cheery and like a lovely thing. But it's nice sort of like restoring and renewal of like the original image of struggle and strife that was between the two of them, and now it's made whole as they come tumbling over each other for some reason. I don't know, but it's kind of a nice image. And I think that's all. Oh yeah, they're all seeing the face of God, which is all really nice. So things seem rather happy and cheery, but we have more to come, and this ends the 20-year saga of Jacob getting a whole bunch of kids. And now we'll see. Now we finally get to the promised land, and things really. Well, now we got to follow Joseph, and that's a whole kind of sad story too. But beautiful story too. All right. Any quick questions, and then we'll go.
So what's the story about the Rachel taking all the guys?
Oh, the household gods?
Yeah, we talked about that for a long time, and I'm trying to figure out what the significance of that was supposed to be.
I wish I had a better answer for you. I don't know. It seems odd, like if she's trying to like hold on to something from from her own sort of community and life, and Laban's understandably like upset that like something was stolen from him, but then she like deceives, and it's very odd. It does serve as a bit of a catalyst for Jacob to sort of own up his own frustration with Laban after all these years, that when Laban appropriately calls him out for stealing, and he like, it's true that something was stolen from him, but Laban or Jacob doesn't know, and then that sort of like kickstarts Jacob into letting him have an earful. But why she stole them, I don't really know.
I think the whole question was, God was very specific not to marry Canaanite women, because you didn't want to have other gods, other
That's
women's
true.
gods, other families' gods.
Right.
Stick with your family because they know the one and true God, but yet Laban has got these idols and these other gods that he's obviously getting some kind of divine information from. just seems,
It does seem odd, because it mentioned it several times that he does have, and it's unclear if, like, where exactly that divination comes from, or that inspiration. And some could read it plainly as, well, God is still, the true God is like at hand in Laban's life. But it is odd that it sure seems like he's pretty open to like talking to or thinking about all these other gods, which are sort of, outside what they should be doing.
The Israelites have false gods throughout the Bible. So, I mean,
They do. They
it's
get
not
sort
any,
of infatuated and interested.
Baal and then the golden calf and
Yeah.
all of this stuff. So it's
They
not
get distracted.
unusual that they have the one true God kind of in the back of their mind, and they have all these other false gods around them too.
Which happens, which is like a real life depiction of some of our own lives where we struggle to keep focus too. But it is unclear ultimately Frank's point, and I wish I had that answer, but I'll dive a little deeper.
that's a good point, Lisa, about the golden calf and stuff.
Yeah,
Like, they get
yeah.
distracted
It's
all-
not just
all the
Laban
time.
who's the bad guy here. They all.
Right, yeah, that's the point.
Well, because they struggle. They
Yeah.
struggle. That's a perpetual cycle.
Well, they don't
that
have
we'll see.
faith, so they want something tangible to look at.
It happens. It happens. And we all do too. All right. Oh,
I just want to say one thing that I read in my commentary.
Yeah.
Is about Jacob wrestling with the angel, and it says, I think it's St. Augustine, says that to wrestle with God is to struggle for virtue.
yeah.
And I'm like,
Uh-huh. It is good. I mean, that's like the virtuous life doesn't come without some struggle and some breaking down of oneself too. That's good. All right, let's stand and have prayer.